Has there ever been a time in your life when you've been afraid? Probably think back to several instances throughout your lifetime, whether as a child or a young adult or as an adult or as you've continued to age, where you have found yourself in a fearful situation, or you have looked at what lies before you and you have been afraid. Now, fear is something that I believe is inherent to sinful man because of the very nature of fear. Oftentimes, fear comes about as we assess the circumstances that we face, and we assess this with our own ability and with our own strength. And as we look at our circumstances, whatever they may be, and we look at them in comparison to our strength and our ability, we more times than not find ourselves greatly lacking. So as we find ourselves lacking, this is where fear oftentimes begins, because we have questions. How am I going to be able to handle this? What am I going to do here? What happens if this happens? And then we start playing the what if game, and that can go on forever, where you just keep saying, well, what if, what if, what if, what if? And again, this is all because we're looking at what we have going on in our lives and comparing that to our strength, our ability, our potential to do something about an area, a situation that does not go as we may have planned. This is oftentimes why you see teenage boys and young men tend to not have a lot of fear, because they have a very false perception of their own strength. This is why you see people who are very prideful and very boastful and full of themselves oftentimes not expressing fear, because again, they have a false view of their own strength and their own ability. Now, it wouldn't take long to look around in our lives and find something to be fearful about. It could be potential health issues. It could be uncertainty. It could be pressure to perform and to meet expectations in a job. It could be a number of things. All you really have to do is just turn on the news for about an hour, and they will give you a list of things to be fearful of. Whether it is a new sickness, or whether it is the potential of war, or whether it is not, or whether it is the potential economic collapse, whatever the case may be, and notice most of these things are potential. There are plenty of things in our lives that we can look at and be fearful for. Conveniently enough, though, as the Bible tells us as Christians, this spirit or this feeling of fear, again, as Christians, does not come from God and should not be a controlling factor in the life of a Christian. In fact, just over in Psalm 56, we see a verse that states, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." So we're seeing this development of recognizing that there are times where we are fearful, but as Christians, we also know that this feeling, this idea, this concept of fear does not come from God. This morning, we are going to take a deeper look into trusting God during our times of fear. And we will be getting all of this from Psalm chapter 46, and a message that I've entitled, Turning to God in Times of Fear. Turning to God in Times of Fear. We'll begin by just reading the first verse of Psalm chapter 46. It says, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." As we look to turn to God in times of fear, the first thing that we need to do is understand who God is. So our first point, we see who God is. Now, this point is really the entire crux of the argument the entire foundation of which everything that we are going to be basing this ability to overcome fear in our life off of who God is. And who you believe God is will determine whether or not you will be able to overcome fear. Now that word believe is very important, because believing brings about action. If you believe something, you act upon that. There are plenty of things that we may have as knowledge, but we don't always act upon that knowledge, whether we believe it or not. But when you believe something to be true, then you act upon that belief. So who we believe God to be is going to be determined by our action as we live our lives. And we see in this first verse that God is described for us in 3 different ways. Now, it's important to note with this that every single one of these ways would be sufficient enough, and God could have just given us one of these ways to be reliant on Him as we seek to overcome fear. But yet we see 3 presented for us. Just again showing the abundant grace that is given to us through God. That it's not just God is giving us one thing to help us out, but God is more than giving one way, but several ways in which we can rely on Him. And each one of these plays a unique role in helping us overcome fear, but all determining and basing it off of who we believe God to be. The first one that we see is the word refuge. God is our refuge. Now, a refuge can be a wonderful thing. Oftentimes, when I think of a refuge, I think of typically a structure, a sound structure, a structure in which you can, again, rely on. Now, another thing that I think can help us relate and kind of bring this concept of a refuge a little bit clearer in our minds is maybe the concept of being caught outside unprepared in a storm. Right? We've probably all been there where we weren't expecting it to rain. We weren't expecting this storm to pop up, and then we find ourselves with no raincoat, no umbrella. We're out just kind of not stranded per se, but we're caught in the rain. And as this probably could have even played out a little bit yesterday, I know it rained kind of randomly at 2 different times. I was joking with my wife, the 2 times that it rained yesterday was 1 when I was changing my oil and 2 when I was outside grilling. It just happens to work like that sometimes, where you get caught off guard, blue sky 1 second, next time it opens up and you're in this rainstorm. And if you've been in this situation, oftentimes you look for a place of refuge. You look for a building that you can go into to get out of the rain. You desperately are looking to get to your car in the parking lot to prevent from being completely soaked from the downpour. Sometimes it's even searching just for an overhang to get out of the elements, an overhang of a building, or even at times a tree, just to try to stay dry. With any of these, this is a concept of something that is to protect us from the onslaught of, in this case, rain that may be coming down. And there is a level of comfort that is brought about by the safety and the relief that that refuge provides. Right? We get into that building when it's starting to rain and we can breathe that sigh of relief. We finally get to our car and sit down inside a car and watch the rain beat on the windshield and think, I'm glad I finally got to my car. Or finding that overhang that you can get out of the rain from. In our lives, God is that refuge. God is that comfort and that relief in time of trouble. God is that secure place in which we can go to when things become difficult. when things become troubled, when we begin to be afraid. But a key is we have to run to him during these times. We have to go into that refuge. Right? You can see the folly of, if it's raining outside, and standing outside of the building and looking at the building as the rain is coming down and wondering to yourself, well, why am I getting wet? There's a building right here, as you're standing outside. Right? It's a bit of a silly illustration. But you obviously need to go into the building to get out of the elements. Right? We can't find ourselves potentially falling into this position where we are in situations of distress, we are in situations of fear, and we look at God, but we don't turn to God. We can't allow ourselves to look at God and say, why am I afraid, when we aren't turning to him as our refuge? When we aren't running to him as that place of comfort and that place of relief? But this takes trust. It takes trust to step out of yourself and step into God. To release the reins and give them to God. The second area in which we see that God is for us is he's our strength. So he's a refuge, a place where we can go for relief, for comfort, but he's also our strength. We've established that fear comes about as we assess our own strength to a situation. And we know by looking at our own lives consistently that man's strength fails. And it fails consistently and constantly. And this is because God has created us to be dependent creatures. God has instilled in us a dependency on him. Now, this is why we have the difference between, fear being common to sinful man, but as Christians having the ability to overcome fear. Because as sinful man who is programmed to be dependent on God does not have God in his life, this constantly provides fear. Whereas a Christian who now has fellowship with God through Christ is able to be dependent and reliant on God as he was created to be. So, since we are dependent creatures, God provides us with his strength. God provides us with his strength to be able to depend on, where we don't need to rely on our strength, but rather we can lean and depend on God's strength. But God's strength is interesting in the way that it is given to us. Oftentimes I feel that we treat God's strength almost as like a medication or like a pill. To where when we feel like, oh, I don't have enough strength right now, God, give me strength, and he pops a little strength pill in your hand that you can take. And you ask God, and it becomes available. The interesting part is that we can see in Scripture is that God's strength is always available to the believer. It's not that God is withholding this until, we have to ask, and God has to look at, okay, does this situation really need strength? Does this situation not need strength? Do I think they can do it without my strength? And he's going through this checklist to see if we qualify for the strength that he's going to give us. It's not what we see. We see that God's strength is always available to the believer, but it's whether or not the believer acts and lives off of the ever-abundant and available strength. That is the question. God's strength is always available to us, as he has promised. But so often, we drift away from this strength. So often, we do not live and act as though we have access at any point to this strength. Really, we need to be looking at our circumstances not from the perspective of our strength, but rather we should be looking at our circumstances in the perspective of God's strength. But also understanding that God's strength is available and sufficient and abundant, but it is sufficient and abundant to handle the situations in which we need to handle them. And this is where I referenced this a little bit in the intro, where we start playing these what-if games, right? Where something goes wrong, a circumstance isn't right, and we say, well, what if this happens? Then what if this happens? And what if this happens? And what if this happens? And we become overwhelmed because we have made this huge hypothetical scenario in which 95% of it is not even real. It's just what we've blown up in our head. And we think, how am I ever going to get through this? How am I going to have strength? Is God going to give me the strength for this? When what we need to be doing is we need to be looking at the challenges that we're actually facing. Looking at the struggles that we're actually going through. Try to turn away these what-if scenarios and rely on God's strength for the present moment in time. Because God, again, has promised to give us strength, has promised abundant strength. But He's not going to give us the strength for potential hypothetical scenarios that we've built up in our heads. He's going to give us strength for what we need strength for. But again, this takes that action of faith. Because oftentimes, as we move forward, this is when that strength is seen and evidenced in our lives. If we wait until we feel that we have the complete sufficiency of strength before we move forward and before we make a decision, then we'll probably just be stuck in neutral for quite some time. Because there's a level where we need to step out into faith, and as we step in faith, God provides. Which leads us right to the third area in which God helps us. And it's the fact that He is our help. So we see that God is our refuge. We see that God is our strength. And we see that He is a very present help in trouble. He is the source of help in the midst of our difficulties. And it's interesting to note that this help is a very present help. Not only is it present, but the extent to which it is present is that it's very present. It's close to us. It is ever present. It is ever available. God doesn't just give us a safe space as a refuge and pack us up with some strength and then tell us, go on, you got this, I believe in you, you'll be fine, and He sits back. That's not how God is. That's not what God does. God is right there with us every single step of the way, ready to help us at any moment that we need help. So He's that refuge that we can turn to. He's the one that is providing us strength. And He's right there with us, presently with us, very presently with us, in times where we need help. An illustration that came to my mind is ice skating, in a way. And I looked at my wife and she smiled because she might know where I'm going with this. I essentially grew up on ice skates. I was skating probably before I was 3 years old. And I am a proficient skater, I would say. Now, my wife is not as a proficient skater. And it's taken some practice to get to where she is relatively confident. Now, when we go skating together, I try to give her instruction. I try to show her how to skate, some techniques that she can use not to only go forward but also to stop and to keep her balance and not feel like she's going to fall backwards. And I can present her with that. I could always be potentially that refuge that she can go to if she's struggling with something. But when we skate, I skate with her. Now I know she can skate on her own because she can skate on her own. She doesn't always believe that she can skate on her own. But I'm there with her, ready to help her whenever she needs help skating. Whether she loses her balance or feels insecure about it, I'm right there holding her hand, making sure that she feels safe and confident as she continues to move forward. And really the amazing part is, and I think she's realizing this now, is that oftentimes I'm not doing as much as she thinks I'm doing. This is kind of the way that God is with us, where we rely on Him. We are, so to speak, skating through life, feeling as though we're going to fall, and maybe sometimes falling and losing our balance, but God is right there to hold us up. God is right there to give us the confidence, just knowing that He's there to help if we need Him. Oftentimes we do need Him, and that's where the illustration breaks down a little bit. But we see that He is our help. We can see who God is for us in this verse. He's that refuge, that safe place where we can have relief. He's our strength, always available, giving us what we need. And He is our help, right there every step of the way, even in the most fearful situations of our lives. So we see from verse 1 who God is. But remember that this is only as valuable as how much you believe this to be true. And again, belief. Action based off of what you know. You're believing it and acting upon it. Do you believe God to be this? Does your life show God to be this? And it's only as insightful as that. But secondly, we see what God has promised. So as we look to turn to God for help, we see who God is, but secondly, we see what God has promised. And this is going to take up the rest of the psalm, verses 2 through 11. So I'll read those and we'll see what we have. It says, therefore, based off of that first verse that we just covered, therefore will we not fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof, Selah. There is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her, and that right early. The heathen raged. The kingdoms were moved. He uttered his voice. The earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. Come, behold the works of the Lord. What desolations he hath made in the earth. He maketh wars to cease unto the end of the earth. He breaketh the bow, and cutteth the spear in sunder. He burneth the chariot in the fire. Be still, and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Selah. So as we continue to look at overcoming fear, we see that our ultimate hope, our ultimate card to play against fear, is the promise and the assurance of the eternal hope that we have in God. The psalmist illustrates probably the deepest form of fear that we may have, and that is the fear of natural disaster. Verses 2 through 3 cover this. We see in those verses the earth being removed, the mountains being carried into the midst of the sea, Waters thereof roar and be troubled. Mountains shake with the swelling thereof. Again, if we define fear as man assessing the troubles that they have in his own strength, natural disasters have to be on the top because man has no ability against a natural disaster. Man can't stand out there and tell when the earth is quaking to say stop shaking and have it stop. It's going to continue to shake. Man can't go out there and say, tell a hurricane to turn around and go back. We have no ability to prevent or mitigate natural disasters. They happen. And we see that we shall not fear even in the midst of these natural disasters. Even in the midst of the earth shaking, mountains being carried into the sea, waters being troubled. If all that happens, we have no need to be fearful. Because one, God is our refuge, God is our strength, and God is our help. But also, let's look at verses 4 and 5. This is in contrast to verses 2 and 3. There is a river, the streams whereof shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her, and that right early. We see the psalmist contrasting the destructive nature of natural disasters with the blessed hope of our home that we have in heaven. Because you can see the direct correlations. Right? In verse 2, it says, though the earth be removed. Verse 5, God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. Again, though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, she shall not be moved. We're seeing the direct contrast between earth and the potential destruction there with the hope that we have of eternity with God. So even if nothing else, we don't need to fear because of our eternal destination with God. But what about tyrannical leaders and evil men? Well, they must be up there too in our fear scale. Natural disasters, evil people, tyrannical leaders. Look at verse 6. The heathen raged. The kingdoms were moved. He, referring to God, uttered his voice. The earth melted. In comparison to God and what God will do in the last days, there's no need to fear a tyrannical leader. There's no need to fear evil men. Because the one that is our refuge, the one that is our strength, the one that is there constantly helping us, the one who has assured us of this eternal hope that there is a river of streams that make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacles of the Most High, where God is in the midst, and it shall not be moved, because God shall help her. That God is the one who, when he utters his voice, the earth melts. He gives us just a small taste of the strength and the power that God possesses. That literally, the uttering of his voice melts the earth. Just his voice and the utterance of it. There's no need to fear, because ultimately we know that God is with us and God is our refuge. And we, again, get a picture in verse 7. The Lord of hosts. Oftentimes when we see this in reference to heavenly hosts, angels, the Lord of all created things, not just here on earth, but also in the spiritual realm. That Lord is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Now, for time's sake, we won't go into a deep dive of the significance of the God of Jacob. we'll try to do a little bit of a brief bit of an overview, but if you're familiar with the life of Jacob, Jacob was not the most upright individual, right? He stole his brother's birthright. He tricked his elderly father to give him that birthright. He basically took advantage of family and stole money. Jacob is not considered on that surface to be maybe the best of people, but yet God was still his God. And the God of Jacob is our refuge. And this, many commentators have pointed to the fact that all can come to God. And there is no prerequisite of a level of goodness, a level of our own ability to please God in order to take up God as our refuge. That God is there to save sinners and to be a refuge for those who need him. But we see another aspect of why we need not fear. Not only is God our refuge, strength, and help, not only do we have the hope, even though things may go terribly wrong here on earth, which if you read Scripture, you know that things will continually get worse and worse until Christ comes back. That even though all these things are happening, that we have a hope in God. And we also have the assurance knowing that God, in the last days, will make all things at peace. Verse 8, come, behold the works of the Lord, what desolations he hath made in the earth. He maketh wars to cease unto the ends of the earth. He breaketh the bow, cutteth the spear asunder, burneth the chariot in fire. All things will be at peace. And notice even just the different layers of potential fear that we've covered. Natural disasters, things that are completely out of our control. Evil, tyrannical people that may be ruling over us. Wars. God takes care of all of that. And then we see some instruction here in verse 10. It's simple instruction, but sometimes complicated to execute. When we're going through times of fear, when we're going through times of struggle, the psalmist is instructing us to be still and know that I am God. Be still. It's a hard thing for us to do, especially when experiencing fear, especially when experiencing uncertainty. Oftentimes we let our minds wander. Sometimes what we claim to be uncontrollable. We know that it's not uncontrollable. We know that we can be still, because if we couldn't be still, then God wouldn't have commanded us to be still. Times where we're overwhelmed, times when we're fearful, turn off that TV. Turn off your cell phone. Get away from other people that may be talking. Don't sit there and talk to yourself or hum to yourself or sing to yourself. But sit. Be still. Control those thoughts. And we control those thoughts with that second part. It's not just being still, but it's knowing that I am God. Tying it right back into, who do you believe God to be? Do you believe him to be your refuge? Do you believe him to be your strength? Do you believe him to be your help? In those times of fear, in those times of uncertainty, turn off all those distractions. Even if a distraction is potentially yourself trying to get away from the fear. Be still and meditate on God. Know that I am God. I am the God that we see in verses 4 and 5. That makes glad the city of God, that river. that is in the midst of the city that shall not be moved, that is the help for that city. That I am that God that can utter his voice and melt the earth. That I am the God that will make wars to cease. I am that God. Be still and know. He continues, I will be exalted among the heathen. I will be exalted in the earth. The ultimate assurance of knowing that God has secured the victory. The psalm caps with verse 11, which again is the same as verse 7. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. In our times of fear, the Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Be still and know. This brings us to a few final points this morning. First, and most importantly, who do you believe God to be? Who do you believe God to be? Not just who you may know in your head God to be, not just what me and Pastor stand up here and tell you who God is, but who do you believe God to be? Do you believe him to be your refuge? Do you believe him to be your strength? Do you believe him to be your help? Do you hope in what God has promised? Do you hope in the promise of strength and help and refuge? Do you hope in the promise of eternity? And finally, will you be still and know that I am God? Let's pray. Father, we come to you now. Our fear seems to be an ever-present part of our lives, or because we know that we are weak, or we know that our strength fails. We know that we were built to be dependent on you, that you want us to be dependent on you, and that you provided ways for us to be dependent on you. For this is why you have not given unto the believer a spirit of fear, because of what you provided for us as we depend on you. Help us to believe in you, believe you to be our strength, our refuge, our help. Help us to act upon that. And we thank you for the victory that you've secured, or that no matter what may come in our lives, and we know that as we have placed our faith and trust in you, that our soul is secured. That everything else can be stripped away, but we know that we are safe and sound in your arms. Or in the midst of our troubling times, our potential fearful times, help us to be still. Help us to set aside all distraction, anything that may get between us and you. Help us to meditate upon you and know that you are God. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.